a subject, namely a transcendental or absolute subject. In idealism, the subject is therefore one part and at the same time the whole. From a different perspective, idealism understands the object as constituted by the human subject, but at the same time, this product must be opposed to the same subject as something that the subject discovers. This contradiction, Adorno says, is nonsense, and actually he uses the kind of the English word in this nonsense, and a scandal. Although Hegel criticized Kant's transcendental subject, for Adorno, Hegel did not really overcome its constitutive formality. What spirit is for Hegel is for Kant the transcendental subject, insofar as Hegel attempts to expand it beyond the boundaries of the thing in itself. In absolute idealism, thus looms the primacy of the subject. Hegel's allegedly absolute idealism is for Adorno nothing more than transcendental subjectivism. Those are Adorno's words. Fichte begins the science of knowledge with the pure identity of the I with itself. Thus, Adorno also distinguishes Hegel's approach from Fichte's. Indeed, at the beginning of the science of logic, Hegel rejects, as Adorno openly recognizes, indeterminate identity as the first principle of the system and replaces it with the determinate being, which develops all determinations out of itself. Adorno does not overlook this decisive difference between Hegel and Fichte. He nonetheless claims that Hegel's absolute idealism ultimately results from a deeper radicalization of Fichte's idealism through the further extension of its main principle. Adorno describes, therefore, Hegel's relation to Fichte as contradictory. Despite opposing Fichte, Hegel does not give up Fichte's general project of deriving determinate contents from the identity of the I with itself. Thus, he does not abandon the fundamental claim of the preeminence of the subject. Along these lines, Adorno also rejects Hegel's thesis that the result of the negation of negation is affirmation. For Adorno, a further negation cannot reduce the non-identical to the first identical moment that non-identical negates. If restoration of identity were possible, it would mean that the first negation had not been negative enough. The non-identical cannot be subsumed under the identical as a moment of its renewed identity. If the non-identical could be reduced to the identical, it would no longer be non-identical. In the same way, the identical would cease in turn to be identical to itself. For Adorno, this impossibility is the index of the irreducibility of the identical and the non-identical. The scandal of absolute idealism consists precisely in the fact that what the subject is supposed to have produced must at the same time persist as something else that stands against it. For Adorno, the pretension of spirit to be the unity of the subject and the object is based on Hegel's hypostatization of the subject. When the subject is hypostatized, sorry, Trish is fine, sorry, hypostatized, yeah. In its abstract difference to the object, the illusion arises that it is no longer opposed to it, since only the concrete subject differs from the object that it knows. According to Adorno, Hegel understands the given as a completely indefinite content. This is a sign that the given is the result of a radical abstraction, but such interpretation of the given is a petitio principii for Adorno. The given is as purely indeterminate, is only a function of the self-understanding of the subject as primarily active and productive, because deprived of determinacy, the given requires a subject to determine it. When the real world is reduced to mere material by a subject that is viewed as exceedingly productive, subjectivity becomes unlimited, absolute. For Adorno, however, the concrete world of determinate things always remains behind the given, conceived of as the last remnant of an expanding abstraction. Absolute idealism is thus an infinite regress of reduction of the given. If the given were completely reduced to a moment of the subject, the process of its assimilation as a non-identical element would cease. Thus, the non-identical in relation to the spirit is as such a necessary, irreducible moment of the activity of knowledge. The human spirit tries to reduce it to its own self-identity, but the non-identical given has to remain in its non-identity in relation to the spirit. The non-identical given therefore implies an inner tension in the concept of spirit, a contradiction that cannot be solved and undone. Adorno claims that absolute idealism aims to reduce the non-identity of an empirical given to the known subject, but he considers that such reduction is nothing but a logical juggling act. Hegel understands the non-identical as an instantiation of the universal concept of non-identity. By means of this consideration, the non-identical is supposed to be successfully assimilated by the subject. For Adorno, however, in order for the activity of knowledge to take place at all, the non-identical must be respected as such, and it must persist in its own irreducible non-identity against the subject that knows it. Kant construes the object as a synthesis of empirical material and categorical form. Absolute idealism assumes the same conception of the object, but tries to reduce the object entirely to the categories with which the subject understands its structure. The subject as a formative power and the object as entirely deprived of determinacy are correlative theses. If one gives up the claim to primacy of the subject, one must give up the conception of the object as mere material for the same reason. That the subject provides the object with determinacy is only a plausible claim if it is capable to completely subjugate the object. The object that is thought of as what remains after the subject has extracted its subjective components from it is for Adorno, however, a delusion of the metaphysics of the human mind proposed by idealism. The object is more than mere facticity. There is nothing in the world, says Adorno, that is composed of facticity and concept. Hence, the alleged power of the conceptual activity of the human mind must be mystified in order to prevent its limitless expansion over the object. Thought should not become abstract. According to Adorno, concepts refer to something that is as such non-conceptual. This non-conceptual element in concepts provides them with their meaning, and by doing so it transcends them. In this context, Adorno refers to Kant's assertion that concepts as such are empty. By correlating Hegel's concept with Kant's empty concept, Adorno understands conceptual activity as intrinsically formal and equates the other of the concept, that is, the non-identical, with the empirical content. Adorno thus endorses Kant's conception of the passive constitution of intuition as the legitimate source of knowledge, and also defends the thesis of the irreconstructibility of empirical determinacy. Concepts, Adorno continues in another passage, indicate a deictic moment. Insofar as the content of concepts is conceived of as abstractly universal, it needs something external, namely the empirical content, in order to become singular and be able to relate to the world. In equating de facto non-identical with empirical, Adorno equates Hegel's spirit with abstract universal activity. In this context, empirical contents are again construed as different from the empty spirit, and therefore as containing in themselves a direct connection to the external world. Since for Adorno absolute subjectivity results from the hypostatization of thought, which he regards as formal, subjectivity lacks the constraint that is necessary to explain the phenomenon of knowledge of the non-mental world. If thought is only the abstract identity with itself, it must spin and tether in the void. In this frame, perception must convey thought with its connection to the real world. Thought must receive the fixed point from perception, which provides it with the consistency that it does not have itself. Since the truth depends on the relation of thought to the real world, idealism, according to Adorno, makes the concept of truth impossible. In other words, objectivity is impossible unless thinking is tied to something that is not itself thought. For Adorno, the concept of labor is hidden behind Hegel's spirit, as the young Marx made clear in his economic and philosophical manuscripts. The condition of possibility of combining Hegel's concept of spirit with labor is the consideration of the content of thought as entirely deprived of own determinacy, and thus as an amorphous material that thought must shape and appropriate through its activity. When Hegel speaks of the labor of the concept, in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, he does not mean it, Adorno claims, metaphorically, but literally. Adorno associates Hegel's notion of thought more specifically with non-physical intellectual work, and relates his conception of spirit to the privilege that bourgeois society assigns to non-physical work over manual labor. Non-physical work relates to nature as a material that is dominated by human activity. For Adorno, the conception of spirit as essentially active, as pure activity that overcomes and abolishes the resistance offered by the empirical given, implies the cult of the activity of producing. The ideology that portrays human beings as masters who rule nature is the final consequence of bourgeois subjectivism, which regards the world as the result of human labor and consequently as a kind of commodity. According to Adorno, the conception of spirit as absolute is based on the exaltation of non-physical work. But to idolize non-physical work implies in turn absolutizing and justifying class relationships, because if human beings did not have to work, there would be no relationships of domination between them. Adorno also connects the absolute character which absolute idealism grants human thought with the concept of the system. Systematization is a theoretical extrapolation of the human claim to power and order over matter. In a barely veiled allusion to Nietzsche's famous dictum that spirit is in fact most like a stomach, Adorno states that the system is the belly that has become spirit. The system is the geistige Rollen. For Adorno, the idea of the system has its prehistory in the animal life of the species. Predators jump on their prey, subdue them with power and violence, and assimilate them to themselves. In absolute idealism, this pattern of behavior is sublimated into epistemology. For Adorno, Kant's transcendental subject, Fichte's absolute I, and Hegel's spirit are all the result of the abstraction from empirical subjectivity. Although Hegel allegedly tried to conceal its origin, the concept of absolute subjectivity can only be obtained from individual subjects. Hegel's model for understanding the relation between human spirit and the given is nothing more than the model of the social process of labor. The human spirit seeks to impersonate the absolute subject, but being in reality the result of the abstraction of the empirical I, it contains with itself society as the context of functions of the singular subject. In Hegel's philosophy, Adorno claims, society should be part of what was constituted by the spirit. However, society cannot legitimately be characterized as a constituted component of spirit. Rather, it is a transcendental one, since it is integrated into the spirit as it is derived from the concrete living subject by abstraction. According to Adorno, Hegel tries to remove the trace of individual consciousness from the foundation of his concept of spirit, even though individual consciousness is the only thing capable of real experiences. Since only individuals can be unhappy, Hegel tries to suppress the critical potential contained in the concrete living subject. So Adorno portrays Hegel as an arch-bourgeois thinker. Okay, and this is what comes now is my reconstruction of the answer that Hegel might have given Adorno to his criticism. Hegel's absolute idealism, the intrinsic unity of mind and world. Absolute idealism, Adorno claims, would have overcome itself from within if it had realized that the identity of the subject and the object cannot be a subject again, and therefore that the object cannot be reduced to a mere moment of the subject. Now, Hegel also characterized such a scandal, as Adorno puts it, as a contradiction. It is in fact this contradiction, the contradiction implied by consciousness, that led Hegel to develop the concept of spirit as the unity of subject and object. Indeed, Hegel would not have disagreed with Adorno's claim that subject and object are defined only by the fact that they differ from one another. Rather, what Hegel seeks to explain is that although object and subject are certainly different from one another, they are at the same time identical with one another in the act of true knowing. The theoretical model that Hegel tries to develop aims to explain the curious fact that object and subject are different but become identical with each other in the act by which the object is known by the subject. Such a model must at the same time be able to explain the phenomenon of self-consciousness, since in self-consciousness the object of which the subject is aware is explicitly the subject itself, a subject that, without ceasing to be a subject, recognizes itself as an object. Inspired by Fichte, Hegel realizes that a new paradigm is required to understand the nature of consciousness and self-consciousness. Hegel's spirit is not unlimitedly expanded consciousness, but a subject that cannot be understood in its own specificity, so long as it is viewed as radically different from the object it knows. Thus, the scandalous contradiction Adorno sees in idealism does not necessarily lead to rejecting the possibility of absolute idealism. Properly understood, it leads to questioning the reflective model on knowledge and self-consciousness of transcendental idealism. In Hegel's philosophy, spirit cannot be considered a further expansion of the subject, abstractly opposed to the object. The result of such an expansion would just be a more abstract version of the same subject. That is to say, it would still be consciousness. That's exactly the criticism that Hegel aims to Kant and the early Fichte. Compared to the idealism of Kant and Fichte, or rather the early Fichte, Hegel argues that absolute idealism introduces a theoretical revolution. The dividing line is not between idealism and realism, but between realism and subjective transcendental idealism on the one hand, and absolute idealism on the other. Hegel's answer to the apparent contradiction of unifying subject and object in the subject is that the subject is never only a subject, but is rather, from the very beginning, unified with the object. The subject's self-conception, as opposed to that of the object, is flawed. The subject is at every moment unified with the object. The difference between subject and object becomes an exclusive relation when, and only so as long, as the subject understands itself as formal and empty. That is, the subject initially knows itself as an immediate, undifferentiated unit with a determinate content. Then it asserts difference between the definite content as it is in itself and as it appears to the subject. At this stage, the subject understands itself as formal and therefore excludes the determinate content with which it is nevertheless connected, since it knows the content as an object even if it sees itself as empty. That's the contradiction of consciousness. And that's what leads from phenomenology to psychology, from consciousness to spirit. When the subject realizes that it has never ceased and can never cease to be united with the object it knows, it recovers its unity with it. For Hegel, spirit does not arise from an abstraction from the empirical singular subject, but from the awareness that the activity of knowing differs from the object and contains it in itself. The solution to this contradiction lies in recognizing that thought is determined in itself with the determination that it knows. Hegel certainly characterizes the unity between subject and object as subject, namely as absolute subjectivity or spirit. This is grounded in the perspectival approach to knowledge that is inherent in idealism. It is the subject that actively puts itself in relation with the world, to a world that only becomes an object in the true sense of the word through that activity. It is precisely in this sense that the unity of subject and object can legitimately be characterized as objective. In absolute idealism, as Adorno imagines it, the object is the mere material on which thinking exercises its categorical activity. But unlike in transcendental idealism, in absolute idealism, the subject is supposed to completely subjugate the material, so Adorno thinks. However, since being is for Hegel indivisibly linked with thought, the activity of thinking does not apply itself to the object as material, but it is as such objective, contentful thinking, world thinking. On the basis of Adorno's misinterpretation of absolute idealism, it is possible to recognize the identification of thinking with conceptual activity as different from perceptual knowledge. Indeed, Adorno interprets absolute idealism as a radicalized conceptual project, that is, as a project in which perception is reduced to concepts and sensibility to intelligibility. It is crucial to remember in this context that Hegel distinguishes three types of cognitive activity, namely intuition, representation, and thought, and that he understands thought as the unity of intuition and representation as the respective realms of empirical and conceptual contents. Representation can legitimately, I think I'm tired. Legitimamente, that was easy. Be characterized as the subsumption of perceptual contents and their abstract universal contents. Comprehension, however, should not be confused with an expanded version of representation. Adorno seems to have missed this point. For Hegel, comprehension unifies the concrete perceptual contents of intuition and the abstract universal contents of representation into the theories of the object. Comprehension achieves an adequate theory of the object not through abstractions and subsumptions, but through a system of inferences. In the inference, which is specific to comprehension, perceptual contents are not obliterated. Comprehension does not take place by reducing perceptual contents completely to abstract concepts. That's what Adorno thought. Adorno is right when he thinks that such an endeavor is impossible. Hegel, in fact, would have shared his opinion. Comprehension does not suppress the fundamentally irreducible duality of empirical and conceptual content, but integrates both types of content as different aspects of the same comprehended object. Contrary to Adorno's assertion, the knowing subject is for Hegel not unlimited because it exhausts the totality of the object's determinacy through its conceptual activity. It is unlimited and infinite because the determinate contents which the subject finds as given are already itself, I mean, subject. Adorno attributes a radically conceptualist idea of perceptual knowledge to Hegel. Strictly speaking, however, Hegel's position is independent of the problem of whether perception implies conceptual activity or not. In fact, Hegel reserves a specific role for perceptual content. Human subjectivity is not infinite because its conceptual activity supposedly or allegedly has the capacity to reduce perceptual contents completely to universal categories, but because perceptual contents are not external to the activity of thinking. Thought must therefore be conceived as broader than a purely conceptual activity. Adorno mistakenly considers the alleged reduction of sensitivity to intelligibility to be the main tenet of absolute idealism. The key claim of absolute idealism, however, is the reduction of being to determinacy, and on this basis, the reduction of determinacy to self-determined thinking. Hegel's absolute idealism does not result, as Adorno claims, from the elimination of the difference between empirical and conceptual contents, but from the sublation of the abstract difference between being and thought, between world and mind. According to Hegel, even if the subject abstracts from every possible determination, it cannot conceive of itself but as already determined. More clearly, even if thought negates all possible and real entities and thereby grasps itself as completely without content, it cannot conceive of itself but as already united with being. That is, in other words, as existing thought. From this perspective, it becomes possible to understand Hegel's advocacy of the ontological argument, as well as his positive reappropriation of Descartes' poetry. According to Hegel, the perceived content is not something to which the subject externally applies its activity of thinking. Since perception is another instance of thinking, its content is immanent to thinking. The illusion that the content of perception originates from a realm completely different from the subject is based on the assumption that thought as such is abstract universal activity, so that since perception differs from such thinking, its content can only come from an external, so-called external world. Thought, however, contains perception as one of its own instances. The perceived content is therefore nothing other than the determinateness or determinacy of the act of perception. It is the activity of perceiving as determined. Comprehension should not be understood as an expansion of the practices of subsumption typical for representational thought. It actually sublates any dualism between intuition and representation, between singular empirical contents and abstractly universal contents. For Hegel, then, universality is not primarily abstractness, but that which remains identical with itself in what appears as its other. True universality is nothing but self-determination. Hegel's dialectics does not aim to negate the difference between object and subject by dissolving empirical contents and their abstract universal categorical patterns. It results rather from the process of confrontation of the object with its successive conceptions by the subject trying to comprehend it. The condition of possibility of Hegel's positive dialectics, as opposed to the negative dialectics of Adorno, is only the thesis of the unity of being and thought. At the beginning of the greater logic, Hegel criticizes the conception of being that arises from an abstraction that mistakenly regards itself as unlimited. Hegel does not radicalize the role assigned to conceptual activity. On the contrary, he repeatedly criticizes the scope of validity of abstract concepts. He further claims that what is and ever was are only things that are determinate. Determinate things are not radically different from human thought. Instead, they are instances of thought itself, since thought can only think which is determinate. think is not a pure activity because it is applied to the object that it knows and constitutes its entire determinacy, but rather because insofar as thought is determined in itself, it can only affect itself. The effect of the spirit's activity is the spirit itself. Spirit is for Hegel causa sui. The relation between intelligible and empirical contents differs specifically from the relation between merely mental and real objects. If one equates both relations, thought as such becomes empty and empirical content become real things. However, since thought is structurally connected to the real world, the singularization and objectivation of a particular content inside the totality of contents of knowledge takes place through an internal binding of that content by means of a system of inferences that makes it necessary. Truth, which is understood as a correspondence, that is in Hegel's vocabulary as correctness, occurs only in the context of representational thinking, where merely mental abstract representations meet the abstract external objects of intuition. Against Adorno's assertion that thinking in absolute idealism has to spin frictionless in the void, Hegel argues for a coherent theory of truth, according to which the fixation of thought does not result from the reception of a real thing from an outer realm, but instead from the self-singularization and self-objectivation of the mind's world thinking. Hegel does not seem to have clumsily overlooked the fact that the notion of absolute subjectivity is formed taking the individual living subject as the starting point. In Hegel's system, however, spirit cannot be reduced to the result of an abstraction of empirical subjectivity. The notion of subjectivity obtained through mere abstraction is the notion of a still finite subjectivity, that is, it is still consciousness. Bewusstsein. Hegel regards Kant's transcendental subject together with Fichte's absolute I as being such an idea. In fact, Hegel never severs the connection to the concrete living individual. Hegel's philosophy of spirit begins, in fact, with the embodied mind in anthropology, which lives in a particular place on earth and has natural characteristics that distinguish it as one or the other individual. It is the internal dialectic of the self-conception of the human spirit as being merely natural that rectifies this initial self-conception. But in spirit as such, soul and consciousness are sublated, not erased. Even Hegel's absolute spirit is the same concrete living individual from the beginning. Only the way it understands itself changes through the process. Indeed, for Hegel, absolute spirit results from the universalization of the singular spirit through its interaction with other singular spirits in social life. Spirit, as Hegel understands it, is always a singular subject. What it overcomes through the development of its self-knowledge are only the enduring forms of immediacy, the multiple forms of the status quo. I think it's the final remarks. Adorno's critique of absolute idealism is beset with considerable hermeneutical errors. Adorno does not fail to notice, however, that Hegel addressed many of the open questions of transcendental idealism and tried to solve them. Now, despite recognizing the advantages of Hegel's approach, and compared to Kant and Fichte, Adorno nonetheless maintains that absolute idealism ultimately rests on the radicalization of transcendental idealism as a further expansion of its basic principles. Hegel disagreed with transcendental idealism, but he did not abandon, according to Adorno, its main project of deriving all determinacy from subjective thought. He therefore did not contest the priority of the subject. Although Adorno recognizes the value of many of the solutions that Hegel offers to solve the theoretical tensions within transcendental idealism, he thinks that those solutions do not actually resolve these tensions. In Adorno's eyes, they simply cannot be solved within the idealistic paradigm. It is not unfair to say that Adorno misunderstands Hegel's absolute idealism as a heterodox attempt to further develop Fichte's philosophical program in a divergent way, especially as it is presented in the foundations of the entire Wissenschaftlehre. Yeah. Adorno's supposedly immanent critique of absolute idealism is in fact based on a highly controversial interpretation of Hegel's approach, which is that Hegel's approach is actually to resolve those problematic claims of Kant's and Fichte's variants of idealism that Adorno himself also considers untenable.
Muchas gracias, Héctor. Thank you so much for your presentation. And now we have 10 minutes for questions.
So, on one hand, it could be Adorno as a kind of revitalization of Fichte's position, but it seems for me more a realistic position. So I remember Schulze against Schelling, and it's very similar.
Yeah, I think that Adorno is more, he's openly more Kantian. He values Kant more over Hegel and even over Fichte. So in that sense, you could say that he's closer to Fichte, at least to the early Fichte of the Grundlage of Wissenschaftslehre, than to Hegel, yeah, for sure, and also to Kant, and because he openly values Kant over Fichte and Hegel. So in that sense, he's a realist in that sense. Not a realist, a naive realist, but.
For me, very similar to Schulze.
Well, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that could be. I would not. Yeah, I don't know exactly very well Schulze to say yes or no, but maybe.
Other questions? Please.
Yes, I was thinking that the critique of Adorno to Hegel, I think it's more political also. It has this philosophical aspect, but it also has this political aspect of thinking of Hegel as a founder of like bourgeoisie ideology. And I think it's a bit, I don't know, I concur with you with your interpretation of the dynamics between subject and object, that it's not something separated from the very beginning. But what do you think about the political critique of Adorno to Hegel?
Yeah. Well, sure. I focused more mainly on the, let's say, theoretical aspects, because I think those are the foundations of the political interpretation of Adorno. So that's what he says. What he can relate Hegel's theoretical philosophy with his political philosophy. And he does it because he thinks that the subjectivity is impressive, so to speak. It's like assimilating things and reducing the world as to a just simple matter, or something like that. And that's why he considers he considers Hegel's philosophy as a bourgeois. But Hegel's not doing that. So, I mean, the political philosophy, the way Adorno understands Hegel's political philosophy, it's based actually, it's a result of how he understands or misunderstands Hegel's theoretical philosophy. So I think that's the premise. That's the foundations of this book. That's why I didn't focus so much. Also, it's I didn't have the time to do that. But I think they are related and related as cause effect. I mean, it's like theoretical philosophy, the foundation.
Okay, I think that's here. In ordine. Comenzamos aquí. ¿No lo hemos visto?
Yeah.
Sorry.
How can we understand this misunderstanding of Adorno's reading if I think Hegel is so clear in his critique to Fichte?
Sorry. I don't know if it's if there's like sounds here. Yeah. So and oh, thanks. Yeah,
works.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, because maybe you don't hear it.
Thank you.
Fine.
I can speak a little bit louder.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
fine.
how can we understand this misunderstanding of Adorno if I think Hegel is so clear in his critique to all the idealisms, transcendental idealisms like Fichte, for example, and the principal critique of Hegel to Fichte, I think, is that Fichte fundates, I don't know how to say, it's the start of with the prince, con el príncipe, with the prince, with the with the I equals I. Yo soy yo, con el I igual a.
Do you want to say it in Spanish and then yeah? So,
Sí.
yeah.
Y
So I
entonces,
understand you.
y en ese sentido, ¿cómo se podría interpretar, digamos, eso? How can we interpret this misunderstanding?
No, bueno, ¿quieres decirlo en español?
Sí, sí.
Ah,
Y bueno, o sea, ¿cómo puede llegar Adorno a creer que es un idealismo absoluto, por así decirlo, el de Hegel, en el sentido de que lo que intenta hacer Hegel es mantenerse con la inmanencia del pensamiento, ¿no? Y no ser fundacionalista, por así decirlo? Pero al mismo tiempo entiendo un poco a Adorno en el sentido de que cuando el concepto va como que con su propia lógica interna, digamos, mediándose a sí mismo y obteniendo como nuevas formas, quizás se le podría hacer una crítica a Hegel de que no queda muy claro en qué sentido hace algo distinto a Fichte. Entonces, no sé qué podríamos responder a eso.
Okay. So I think.
No, we understood.
Yeah, more or less. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, what you're saying is that actually it's somehow that Adorno was right in the sense that you cannot have an absolute idealism if you have this difference between object, subject, and an object, and how is it absolute idealism even possible? And more or less in that direction, I think you go. And that's exactly what Adorno says. I mean that absolute idealism is nonsense. It cannot be achieved because it's in itself impossible. But my claim was that I think that he's right as far as he's talking about Fichte or the early Fichte, but not about Hegel, unless he misunderstands, as he does, I think, Hegel's absolute idealism as a radicalized form of a further development of Fichte's project in the Grundlage, something such as there. If Hegel did that, then he would have a point. Adorno against Hegel. But I don't think that Hegel does it. So I think that that's why it's a failed meeting, I call that, because they are talking, in German you have a very nice verb for that, vorbeireden, yeah, for order. Yeah, that's beautiful. Vorbeireden, it's what he does. I mean, it's, okay, he's right, but I'm not saying what you're saying. So you're right as long as you think that I said that, but I didn't. So, yeah.
Okay, we already run out of time, but I know that we have at least other two questions, so I asked if you can both ask your question and to make it as brief as possible.
Okay, I tried to make it. It's very difficult, but I tried. Adorno says that the mediation process between subject and object cannot be finished satisfactorily, because, and I think the reason why he puts it, you said it, is the rupture. There's a division in our society between manual labor and intellectual labor, which is also what Marx criticized on Hegel, and Adorno worked with Sohn-Rethel, for example, on this. And so I think why it cannot be mediated satisfactorily is because the subject, the main subject, the social subject, is always missing a fundamental part of the object. So, but I think, and this is my question, if you perhaps you have a different take on it, because you said the absolute spirit is, at finishing the phenomenologia, the same individual, only in a higher state, and I think that's perhaps the difference, because I think for Adorno, and also I have like a similar reading, is that the subject in the phenomenology is like an individual subject till the mediation between Herr and Knecht. It's not slave, and I don't know what it's called in English. But then at the chapter when he goes to the spirit, Geistkapitel, then it's no longer an individual, but like a social movement. And it is in this social movement that this mediation does not come to a satisfactory end. So perhaps the different interpretation of the phenomenology, which is perhaps the key to this.
Okay. We have there's two different things, because one thing is the consciousness, and even more than consciousness. The consciousness is just a figure of subjective spirit. But then you have even objective spirit, which is the socialized individual and whatever. You have everything that's still, for Hegel, those are finite forms of spirit. So that's why later comes absolute spirit, because Hegel himself thinks that subjectivity cannot subdue, and sublate determinacy and the otherness of determinacy at the level of objective spirit. That means in the relation between subjects. So that's exactly the reason why objective spirit is not absolute spirit, because at that level there's always an otherness, the other object. That's why universal history is actually about infinity, because it's impossible at that level to sublate the otherness, of strangeness, so to speak, of determinism. So Hegel himself would say that too, that it's at that level the other is another, and it will always remain there, even if you configure an order, a universal order between individuals, and will still have the individuals, and that's why objective spirit is not absolute spirit. So again, Hegel would I think he would support what Adorno says, but what he means under absolute spirit is not that. Yeah. So I think it was an answer.
I can make it later.
Okay, maybe it's because there is another section that is starting here in a few minutes. So sorry.